The Houston Texans finished the 2024 season with a 10-7 record and won a playoff game for the second consecutive year. And for the second consecutive year, they lost in the divisional round of the playoffs.
Mahomes steps up, throws, and he got it! Touchdown, Kelsey!
But unlike 2023, with a rookie head coach and quarterback at the time, expectations were significantly higher entering 2024.
I'm backing the Houston Texans, not only to win this division, not only to win the conference, but to make the Super Bowl.
And despite the Texans winning a playoff game this past year, in which they absolutely throttled the Chargers by 20 points in a game Justin Herbert would throw 4 interceptions, the regular season was anything but a smooth ride. They lost by 27 points to the Vikings in Week 3, they lost in a Thursday night game to the Jets later in the year, and then followed it up with a loss to the Lions, the very next game in which they forced 5 Detroit turnovers. And they also eventually lost on Christmas Day at home to the Ravens with a score of 31-2. So while the Texans' wildcard round playoff win was a very fun game for Texans fans and players, it was anything but a normal year for Houston. Former offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick was fired after the season ended, and several changes were made this offseason. I think the Chargers' playoff game smoothed out a lot of frustration from the national media regarding the 2024 Texans season, because there were times last year where it was flat out ugly. And the Texans were a very active team this offseason, and the 2025 Texans will look a lot different than the 2024 Texans. And the big question heading into the year for the back-to-back division champions is, what should we really expect from Houston this year? Well, we're going to break everything down in today's video. If you could like the video before we start, I would really appreciate it, and without further ado, let's begin. And we are starting today's video by discussing who the Texans brought in and who they lost in free agency prior to the 2025 NFL Draft. And for anyone who may not remember, the Texans were a very busy team prior to the draft, both in free agency and of course with trades. They traded for former Cardinals and Jags receiver Christian Kirk for a 2026 7th round pick. I realize Christian Kirk missed some time last year as he only played in 8 games in 2024, but he's still a solid player when healthy. And for Houston to bring in Christian Kirk for the low price of a future 7th round pick was a great job by GM Nick Caserio. And the season-ending injury he had last year was a broken collarbone. Now, I don't want to pretend to be a doctor, but I don't think it should be controversial to say a receiver coming back from a broken collarbone in Week 8 of last year is a lot better of a situation than a player coming off of a torn ACL or torn Achilles late in the season and trying to rush back to be ready for opening day, and you get the point. The Texans also traded longtime left tackle Laremy Tunsil to the Commanders for a combination of middle round picks, and we'll dive into this more in the offensive portion of the video, though I was surprised they traded Tunsil in the first place. They also traded for DB CJ Gardner-Johnson and a future 6th round pick in exchange for former 1st round guard Kenyon Green and a future 5th round pick. Lastly, they traded for former Vikings interior offensive lineman Ed Ingram in exchange for a future 6th. Now, the biggest thing to know for the Texans entering the 2025 free agency period is they had over $43 million in dead cap money, which ranked 11th in the NFL, and this is per Spotrac.com. They have Stefon Diggs and Laremy Tunsil on the books for $16.6 million and $15 million, which makes up over 11% of their salary cap on those 2 players alone. So with $43 million in dead cap, that's going to restrict them a bit in free agency. Their biggest signing was veteran left tackle Cam Robinson, who was a longtime Jag before being traded to the Vikings midway through last year. They signed him to a 1-year, $12 million deal, and they also brought in defensive tackle Sheldon Rankins, who is back in Houston after spending a year with the Bengals in 2024. They also signed guard Laken Tomlinson, who played for Seattle last year, and I'll be honest, I have a lot of questions regarding the Texans' offensive line this year, and specifically the idea to have Cam Robinson and Laken Tomlinson as your starting left tackle and left guard, and we'll see how it plays out, but those are the 2 guys Houston brought in to protect CJ Stroud's blind side this year. They also brought in Darrell Taylor, a pass rush specialist, on a 1-year prove-it deal, and I really like this signing for what it is, even if Taylor doesn't produce all that much this year. They lost Stefon Diggs in free agency, and while Stefon only played 8 games for Houston last year, that was still a position and role Houston had to replace, which I believe they did by bringing in Christian Kirk. They also lost safety Eric Murray, who signed with the Jags in free agency, and while Murray wasn't a really good or really bad player, that is over 800 snaps they have to replace entering 2025. But outside of Stephon Diggs and Eric Murray, they didn't lose that much in free agency. They lost Jeff Okudah, Case Keenum, Delshon Phillips, Robert Woods, and Chris Boyd for reference, all of whom signed for one-year deals on less than $2.5 million. So in a lot of ways, the Texans' biggest moves this offseason came via trade prior to the 2025 draft. Now, for the 2025 Texans defense, this is a unit that's absolutely loaded. We can start with one of the best edge rushing duos in all of football in Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter, or we can talk about a solid linebacking core led by Henry To'oTo'o and Azeez Al-Shaair, or we can talk about what is very clearly one of the best secondaries in football. Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter each had 50-plus pressures last year, and each player had 11 or more sacks. They're also really solid run defenders, and why I like the Darrell Taylor signing specifically is because he can be used in a designated pass rushing role behind both Anderson and Hunter. Darrell Taylor has certainly been a liability at points in run defense over his first 4 years, but he can situationally get after the quarterback, and if there's one thing you can never have enough of, it's pass rush and corner help. And the Texans defense last year was under-recognized by the national media. They had 2 Pro Bowlers in Danielle Hunter and Derek Stingley, and Stingley was a first-team All-Pro. He also had 5 interceptions and signed a 3-year, $90 million contract this offseason. And that was good for Stingley because he was not used in a way to maximize his strengths early on, and there was a lot of noise about how good Sauce Gardner was and how Stingley wasn't producing, yet time has shown both are great players. But the Texans secondary also has not just one, but multiple other good players in Jalen Petrie and Kamari Lassiter. And even second-year safety Kalen Bullock, who was a bit of a developmental player last year, had 5 interceptions in his rookie season and had an opposing passer rating of just 45.0 when targeted in 2024. What was also frustrating for the Texans' defense last year was how little the offense helped them out at times, because this defense finished 3rd in EPA per play and 4th in defensive DVOA. But like we mentioned earlier, Bobby Slowick was fired, and it wasn't because he was great at his job. And also, like we discussed earlier, a lot of the 2024 Texans season, for lack of better wording, was downright frustrating. And I think a lot of people forget just how frustrating it was because of the Chargers' playoff win. Winning, of course, cures everything, but the Texans' offense finished 26th in DVOA last year, as well as 28th in average plays per drive. Meaning there were a lot of times where the Texans' defense was practically begging the offense to go make something happen. The only real weak spot, if you want to call it a weak spot, is the linebackers and the interior defensive line. But what should be noted with each of these units is they're not a net negative. This is not the equivalent of having Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase getting passes thrown to them by Tim Boyle. If you told me the Texans defense would go on to be the best in the NFL this year, I wouldn't bat an eye. They forced 29 turnovers last year and allowed the 6th fewest passing yards of any team in 2024. They have a superstar at corner in Derek Stingley. They have not one, but 2 great edge rushers in Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter, and they're good at stopping the run to get you into clear passing situations, which directly plays into their strengths. The Texans' goal defensively is to get you in 3rd and 8+, so they can have Will Anderson and Danielle get after the quarterback and more or less say good luck to opposing offenses. And more often than not, it works. Now, I do want to note the C.J. Gardner-Johnson injury. There was concern that C.J. Gardner-Johnson tore his ACL and would miss the entire season about a week and a half before this video was released, but as of now, at the time of this recording, it looks like he's going to play most, if not all, of 2025. This is a very good unit and one that is going to cause several teams fits. The only question is if this team is going to be able to hold up offensively. The Houston Texans should have pretty substantial rookie impact in 2025, and it's going to start with their second-round receiver in Jaden Higgins. Jaden Higgins was their first selection of the draft, as they originally had picked 25 and traded back with the New York Giants, and they picked up a 2025 third as well as a 2026 third to move back 9 spots. And I thought that was a really good job by Texans GM Nick Caserio to trade back and to still draft what should be a wide receiver to the future. Now, one thing that I do want to discuss now is it's a lot easier to talk about the draft, 4 or 5 months later than what's happening in real time. And it came out after the fact that the Texans wanted Ohio State offensive lineman Donovan Jackson. And whenever a player is taken directly in front of you in real time, there's a very real sense of panic because, hey, what do we do? Do we panic and make a quick selection and reach for an offensive lineman that's 20 spots ahead of where he should be? No, the Texans did a good job. They traded out of the first round. They received current and future draft capital and still drafted what should be their wide receiver to the future in Jaden Higgins. And with Jaden Higgins here, One thing that I do want to emphasize is I'm not saying to not get excited about a rookie wide receiver, especially one that's in a pretty good situation, and especially for a player in Jaden Higgins that's 6'4", 215, ran a sub 4.5 40, has a 39-inch vertical, and on top of it all, he's not just a great athlete, he's also a really good route runner for his size. And whenever you are a good route runner that's also a good athlete at 6'4", naturally you are going to receive lofty expectations, and typically those expectations, or the comparisons rather, are guys like Drake London and Jaden Higgins' current teammate, Nico Collins. Now, I never want to be the guy that says, hey, you are not allowed to get excited about your team's rookie receiver, especially one that's going to benefit from playing a great secondary every single day in training camp and practice throughout the season, and especially one that is in a good situation for him to personally succeed because of the defense's attention going to Nico Collins each and every week. But what I will say is to have realistic expectations for an early second-round receiver, and I would be absolutely thrilled if Jaden Higgins comes in and has a 750 or 800-yard season, along with 6 to 8 touchdowns. To me, that would be hitting this selection out of the park as a rookie, with him to have room to grow on that in 2026. Now, for Ariante Ursary, this was a selection I liked a lot, all things considered, because when the Texans were on the clock in the second round, or when they traded up to pick 48, the offensive linemen were thinning out in the draft, and I thought there was going to be a clear drop-off between where Ariante Ursary was and the next best offensive lineman, meaning a half a round to a full round grade at that point in the draft. So Nick Caserio knew that he had to do something and quick, and the Texans traded up 10 spots to go get Ursary, and I am eager to see how he plays in 2025 and how he handles speed rushers at the NFL level, because I thought there was some hip tightness during his time at Minnesota and that he struggled at times with speed rushers. But when you are in a phone booth and going pound for pound with Ariante Ursary, this is a guy that you're going to want on your football team. There's probably going to be a couple of plays this year, probably more than a couple of plays, where he absolutely puts somebody in the dirt behind a Joe Mixon run, and you see Ariante Ursary's play on the highlight reel. And this is a player that, I mean, there's a reason he was selected in the middle of the second round to begin with, but this is a player whose floor I think is considerably high, and as long as they give him some chip help with the speed rushers, I think he's going to be a fine player for a long time. And with the emphasis the Texans are going to have on man running principles, especially with Joe Mixon and with Nick Chubb, I really like the selection of Ursary. And with the selections of Higgins and Ursary, like we said earlier, I think they're going to have two players that are going to start, not just for 2025, but really the next 2 or 3 years, and I can't wait to see how these first two picks for the Texans 2025 draft class grows as time goes on. Now, for the rookie impact that third-round receiver Jalen Noel will have, another player from Iowa State, I'll be honest, I don't think he's going to have all that much rookie impact, and that's not a reflection on who he is as a player currently. It's more of a reflection on the roster and already having Christian Kirk in front of him. Maybe midway through the season he takes Christian Kirk's job or takes some snaps from Christian Kirk, or maybe towards the end of the 2025 season, but for this year specifically, and again, it's because of Christian Kirk being in front of him, not that Jalen Noel is a bad player, I do want that part to be clear, I'd be surprised if he has more than 35 receptions. Now, with Jalen Smith, a DB from USC, this was a selection that, I'll be honest, I was not the biggest fan of. I didn't think the value aligned for taking him in the top 100, but I will be honest that I like the landing spot for Jalen Smith, and I have been wrong on a Texans corner before. I was not a big fan of Kamari Lassiter during last year's pre-draft process, and like we always say on the channel, if I'm wrong, I have no problem admitting I'm wrong. Left hand up. Kamari Lassiter proved me wrong in his rookie year. He had a great rookie season for a second-round pick, and it was also a good player going to a good landing spot. So if Jalen Smith proves me wrong, by all means, I'll admit 1 year from now that I'm wrong, but this is a DB that has versatility. He can play in the slot, he can play at corner, and he can also play at safety. So for a top 100 selection, I can understand drafting the versatility. I just didn't think the ability for a top 100 player was there for Jalen Smith, but the Texans are a really good team at developing defensive backs. So if there's going to be anybody that proves me wrong again for the second consecutive year, it's going to be D'Amico Ryans and his team with how they develop defensive backs. Now, the one pick that I will legitimately push back on is the Woody Marks selection, specifically trading a future third-round pick to go up to pick 116 and draft Woody Marks was not a good thought process. At least I didn't understand it, and I know they moved back a couple of spots from pick 25 to 34 early in the draft and received a future third from the New York Giants, but to essentially throw a future third away on Woody Marks, to me, was not good value, and that was kind of why I brought the Texans draft grade down a little bit, because ultimately I like the Jaden Higgins, I like the Ariante Ursary, and I also like the Jalen Noel selections, but trading future draft capital that you had already received from a trade back on Woody Marks for a player that you don't know if he's even going to legitimately start at, not just in 2025, but any point in his career, was a pick that I didn't understand. So again, hopefully he proves me wrong, and I'll be the first to admit that if I was wrong about this, then again, hopefully he proves me wrong, and hopefully he has a great NFL career. That was the first 5 selections for the Texans in the 2025 draft, and after those first 5 selections, they selected safety Jalen Reed from Penn State, Graham Mertz, a quarterback from Florida, Keontae Hamilton, a defensive lineman from Rutgers, and Luke Lachey, a tight end from Iowa. And I don't want to kill the Graham Mertz selection too much because it was a 6th round quarterback. I'll just be honest, I didn't think that Graham Mertz was an NFL caliber prospect, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. But I will end this positively for the rookie impact and say that I think there is a chance Luke Lachey makes the roster, and that there's a chance that he sticks around the league for a couple of years. Overall, we gave the Texans a B+ draft grade, and I think there will be pretty significant rookie impact from both Jaden Higgins and Minnesota offensive tackle Ariante Ursary. With the 2025 Texans offense, the first thing that we have to discuss is change, both from a coaching perspective and from a personnel perspective too. The Texans fired Bobby Slowick after the end of the year last year, and they brought in Nick Haley, who is coming over from the Los Angeles Rams. And there's also going to be a bit of a scheme change too, as Houston is going to want to more or less run the football down your throat, or attempt to, with a man-blocking scheme. And that's going to be the goal of what the Texans are going to do this year, and how that's going to be achieved is going to be something that I'm going to be paying attention to throughout the 25 season, especially with the change in personnel along the offensive line more specifically. The biggest one, of course, is Laremy Tunsil, who has been a Texan for several years now, and Laremy Tunsil, when he plays, is a really, really good left tackle. I'm not going to get into rankings, but the bottom line is he is a franchise left tackle. However, he has one big caveat, and that is penalties. Laremy Tunsil had 19 penalties in 2024, and there was one specific scenario against the Vikings last year in Week 3, in a game Houston would go on to lose by 27 points, in which Laremy Tunsil had back-to-back false start penalties, and to not only just have one penalty, okay, over the course of the season, whatever, that's not a big deal, but to have back-to-back penalties, have your team's drive get pushed back even further and effectively out of field goal range was big in that specific situation. And we talked about the Texans not being great in DVOA rankings and in terms of efficiency last year, but in some ways, Laremy Tunsil was a liability for the Texans last year. Now, one big thing about the player that is going to replace Laremy Tunsil and Cam Robinson is obviously he is not the same caliber of player as Laremy Tunsil. To me, it's not even close. I think there's multiple tiers of left tackle play between Laremy Tunsil and Cam Robinson strictly after the football is snapped. But the decision to move on from a player that had 19 penalties, albeit a tough one, I can understand where the Texans are coming from. And then there's also something that nobody knows about with the culture of the locker room. Is Laremy Tunsil a negative within the locker room? That's a whole other discussion, but I do at least understand the decision for a tackle that is north of 30 in Laremy Tunsil to move on from. But one big thing I do want to highlight with Cam Robinson that is certainly not discussed as much as it probably should be is while Sam Darnold did not have a good final 2 games against Detroit and the LA Rams last year, obviously, Cam Robinson had an absolutely awful final 2 games too. He allowed 21 pressures over the course of those final 2 games, which, by the way, was more pressures than Laremy Tunsil allowed throughout the entire 2024 regular season, and obviously all 21 of those pressures were not on Cam Robinson, as there were not just one, but multiple plays where Sam Darnold was camping back in the pocket and trying to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in the process of finding Justin Jefferson downfield. My point is you don't accidentally allow 21 pressures over the course of 2 games and 2 very good teams in the Lions and the Rams, while your team ultimately gets beat by double digits in each game. So there's not going to be a little bit of a drop-off in play from Laremy Tunsil to Cam Robinson. I think there is quite a bit of a gap between the 2 players, and I hope that the Texans know what they're in for when bringing in Cam Robinson, and at least want to acknowledge that. Now, I don't think Cam Robinson is an absolutely terrible player that's going to be a complete liability every time that he's out there, but I do want those differences between the players to be acknowledged, and the same also applies to new left guard Laken Tomlinson. The other big changes for the Texans along the offensive line was the release of former right guard Shaq Mason, with right tackle Titus Howard kicking inside to right guard, and like we mentioned during the rookie impact, 2nd round selection Ariante Ursary playing right tackle. Now, one thing that I do think is a little overblown, although I think it's definitely worth mentioning, I just think it's a little overblown that, man, CJ Stroud is going to get absolutely destroyed every game, because there's a couple of things that need to be noted. And while I do have some concern with Cam Robinson out at left tackle, the one thing that I do want want to acknowledge is Cam Robinson is not going to be the long-term solution at left tackle for the Houston Texans. Nick Caserio is not bringing him in to protect CJ Stroud's blindside until CJ is 30 years old, and he's going to have him there for the next 6 or 7 years. Obviously, the Texans are aware that Cam Robinson is not at the level of Laramie Tunsil or a future franchise left tackle at this stage in his career. So, believe it or not, if Nick Caley can't call chips to help both Cam Robinson on the left side and Ariante Urshrian on the right side, and he's going to head into a game against the Browns and basically say, hey, Cam Robinson, you have 40 snaps against Myles Garrett this week, empty protection, no help, good luck, buddy, then that's on them as coaches. There should be no scenario where they have Ariante Urshrian, a 23-year-old second-round tackle, one-on-one on an island with TJ Watt all game and basically say, hey, buddy, you're an NFL tackle now, good luck. There's setting players up for success individually, and putting Cam Robinson out there against Myles Garrett all game or Ariante Urshrian against TJ Watt is not setting them up for success. Now, I do think there is a conversation to be had specifically along the interior offensive line whenever the Texans play the great teams in the AFC like the Chiefs with Chris Jones, or now Omar Norman-Lott, a second-round defensive tackle, or the Ravens with Nnamdi Madubuike and how they're going to be able to handle that, because that is a conversation worth having. But the biggest thing for the Texans this year is going to be able to sustain offensive line play and to finish better than 27th in rushing DVOA last year, because, again, we go back to a point that we made very early in the video, was for a team that finished 10-7 and won a playoff game last year, it was a very, very underwhelming season for the Texans, because it seemed at times that there was no hope, and that whenever they would have a slight glimmer of hope, they'd lose to the Titans or they'd lose by 29 points at home to the Ravens on Christmas Day, and you get the point. The biggest thing for the 2025 Texans, especially along the offensive line, is going to be able to establish consistency and ultimately raise the floor from where they were last year. Now, for CJ Stroud entering 2025, really aside from Nico Collins, this is a player I worry about least in the Texans offense, and if he was able to make plays out of situations that simply were not there last year, with each receiver going down at various points in Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, and Tank Dell, and we'll discuss Tank Dell more in a minute, then I think CJ Stroud will be just fine in 2025. I really don't worry about going from a Bobby Slowick to a Nick Caley offense, and I think he will be just fine, and over the past 2 years, he's certainly proved that. I also don't worry about a statistical decline from 2023 to 2024, mainly because the plays and the film was there for CJ to back up what he was making. Yes, there were some questionable decisions, but there's questionable decisions from every quarterback, not just CJ Stroud. You can do that game with Lamar Jackson, who only threw 4 interceptions last year. You can do that game with Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow. You get the point. Every quarterback is going to throw interceptions, and with CJ Stroud, the biggest thing that I would like to emphasize is just take what's in front of you, because there were certainly times last year where he did big game hunt, but overall, CJ Stroud is a franchise quarterback. He's one of the best young quarterbacks we have in today's game, and the only real question that I have for the 2025 Texans is it going to be enough? Because that's going to be a question they're going to have to answer, not just in 2025, but 2026, 2027, 2028, and as long as the big teams in the AFC are there, the Chiefs, Bills, and Ravens, as long as they're there, the Houston Texans are going to have to continuously answer the question, is it enough? Now, with Tank Dell, this is a player that suffered not one, but 2 very serious injuries in the first years of his career, and I hope there's a reality where he comes back healthy in 2026, because right now it's reported that he's expected to miss the entire 25 season, so I am wishing nothing but the best for Tank Dell in his recovery, though football is a very brutal sport, and that is the unfortunate reality of football, though again, wishing nothing but the best for Tank Dell, and hope we get a healthy Tank Dell in 2026. Ultimately, for the 2025 Texans, I think their team ceiling is a divisional round exit, as I don't think they're going to have enough to be able to go into any of Buffalo, Kansas City, or Baltimore and win with the season on the line. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe, as we recently hit 200,000 subscribers, and I cannot thank you guys enough for the support. Until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.